Hi, my name is Kathleen Lugarich, and I'm the Senior Director of Historical Initiatives and Educational Development for the Army Historical Foundation.
And I'm Dallas Looney, and I'm a research historian here at the Army Historical Foundation.
Today, our podcast is going to do a brief movie review. We'll provide some information about a movie related to Army history, as well as some notes about the history behind that movie. We'll also note some things that the movie did well in its portrayal of the Army and story. And today, we're going to talk about Disney's Operation Dumbo Drop from 1995, starring Danny Glover and Ray Liotta, which is a story about moving an elephant to a remote mountain village in Vietnam that is inspired by a true Army story. This movie was released in theaters the weekend of July 28, 1995, and was in theaters at the same time as Waterworld, Clueless, Free Willy 2, and Apollo 13. And according to IMDb, it ranked 70th in the domestic box office for 1995, grossing a little over $24 million. And to give you a comparison, the number one film that year, which I can't believe it's this one, Batman Forever, grossed over $184 million, and the last ranking film at 200 made a little over $2 million. And before we get any further, let me just say that this is a feel-good family movie that is not designed to share the truths and some of the gruesome stories of the Vietnam War. Dallas, what films do you think would do a better job at that?
Absolutely. So truthfully, I haven't seen a movie about the Vietnam War that necessarily has done it justice. I think that speaks to the complexity of experiences that veterans had in describing the Vietnam War. That being said, during the 1970s and 1980s, there were a string of entertaining, if not over-the-top movies focused on attempting to reconcile the experiences of the war with American audiences. Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now come to mind, with varying amounts of Hollywood-esque absurdity sprinkled throughout each film. Very entertaining, though. Movies like Platoon and Hamburger Hill have far less of Hollywood flair, built a little less for entertainment, and attempted to tackle the more seriousness of the war. There are a few noted scenes in those movies that detail the cruel and foreboding aspects of the conflict. Full Metal Jacket does get a few extra points in my book, though, for showing the intensity of the Battle of Hue City.
And we can, of course, add those movies to our review list as we grow our podcast, as this is a brand new season. But I will say that the military advisor for Operation Dumbo Drop, who wrote the story about the actual event, Vietnam veteran Major Jim Morris, he wrote that the movie meant a lot to him because of his involvement with the original event, which was to try and publicize some of the good things that happened in Vietnam. He wanted to make sure that people knew Green Berets did more than just kill people and engage in violence. Now, Operation Dumbo Drop stars Danny Glover, Ray Liotta, Dennis Leary, Dougie Doug, Corin Nemec, and Din Lee, who plays Lin, the young boy who accompanies the elephant Bo Tot, who was played by Tai, an Asian elephant who appeared in multiple movies, including Jungle Book, George of the Jungle, Evan Almighty, and Water for Elephants. And as much as I and many other people have enjoyed these movies featuring Tai and other animal actors, it should be noted that she was subjected to acts of cruelty and torture by her trainers in order to perform in films such as this. And the rights of animal actors is still evolving. Operation Dumbo Drop opens with a brief scene taking place in 1962, 6 years before the movie's main timeline. In the scene, we see a group of Vietnamese are moving along a river when they are caught in the crossfire between American and Vietnamese forces. Dallas, can you give us an explanation as to what is happening in Vietnam during this time?
Sure. Vietnam was in a bit of a precarious situation in 1962. The U.S. had invested sending military advisors over to South Vietnam to try and help the government there. With an ongoing insurgency from North Vietnam. We know that as the Viet Cong, which operated within the South Vietnam countryside. So the country had previously been divided up as part of a 1954 agreement known as the Geneva Accords that divided it. North Vietnam, communist ruled, South Vietnam, democratically backed by the United States government. The United States had a vested interest in Vietnam as part of its goal of containing global communism, and the Kennedy administration focused on supplying and supporting American advisors overseas to help train, equip, and mobilize foreign anti-communist forces. By 1962, however, things were in dire straits with the United States' support of South Vietnam's regime. The South Vietnamese administration, and this is why I put democratically elected in quotations, led by No Dinh Diem, was incredibly corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical. While the administration served as an enemy to the communist North Vietnam, it was a blight on U.S. involvement. A forced relocation program designed to isolate South Vietnamese communities from Viet Cong influence was established with varying degrees of success. ARVN forces, and that's the Army of South Vietnam, were equipped with helicopters and weaponry and encouraged to fight the Viet Cong, the insurgent forces that we talked about, but were often met with defeats and chaotic strategic failures. Any true military mind knew that by 1962, the situation in Vietnam was growing bleak. Further investment had to be made by the United States government in order for the South Vietnamese government to essentially survive.
Thank you, Dallas. And of course, this beginning scene in the movie is very small. And we immediately jump into 1968. So what happens between 62 and 68? Where are we now?
Sure. So 1968, you reach pretty much what I'd argue, the pinnacle of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. 1968 was the year with the highest amount of American troops in country, a total of over 500,000. That's a lot of people. This year was the deadliest in American history for the entirety of the war, with record spending by the Defense Department in an effort to curtail North Vietnamese infiltration into the South, combating the Viet Cong once again. But perhaps most importantly, this was the year of the Tet Offensive. This was a massive operation conducted by the North Vietnamese government to strike at all major population centers, utilizing the Viet Cong. So they're utilizing the insurgency in the South. They want to strike fear into the heart of South Vietnam. This surprise attack was initiated all across South Vietnam and resulted in a tactical defeat by the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong. So effectively, they devoted all of these resources to this great offensive, and tactically, it was a defeat. The United States and the South Vietnamese government crushed it. However, the Viet Cong's tactical capability would never recover from this operation. Now, there are some that say the North Vietnamese government maybe wanted to curtail some of the influence of the Viet Cong in the South, so when they eventually come down south, they don't have this other political force to fight.
Mm-hmm.
Despite this, the footage and news of Americans and their South Vietnamese allies fighting in the streets that were once believed to be safe in the South, along with visuals of American casualties, secured the North Vietnamese a strategic victory. Different from a tactical, the American public witnessed the horrors of war firsthand through their television screens, particularly images and videos of soldiers fighting in areas previously thought to be free of Viet Cong influence. These were regions where the United States government basically said, we've got everything under control, we're fighting effectively, and we're winning the war against communism. So this provided a stark contrast to those statements from generals and the Defense Department at the time. American public opinion was further swayed against the war following CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite's visit to Vietnam and his conclusion that for the United States, quotation, the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
Whew. So there's a lot to unpack in that statement. I mean, first off, you start with over 500,000 people, American troops, are in country. And you'll see some of that influence in the movie we're reviewing, because you see American troops everywhere, especially ever present in the first scenes where they're at an army base, where helicopters are just taking off like mosquitoes off a river or a pond. They're just everywhere. And of course, all these Vietnamese villages are used to seeing American troops, and of course, being questioned by the North Vietnamese who are investigating village involvement. But going back to the Tet Offensive, that's starting in about January 1968, at least the big Tet Offensive, and lasted through the summer of that year. And the events of Operation Dumbo Drop, according to the story that inspired it, take place during April and March of that year. So right in the midst of this massive operation. And I feel that's where you might see some hints in the movie, where there's talk about available budget, strategic importance of the mountain village that is the main focus of the movie, and some of the North Vietnamese activity in some of the towns and villages. Not super large hints, and definitely not explained in terms of how or when the events of the movies take place during Vietnam as a whole. But there are at least some nods to what may have been happening during that time period. Now, in the movie, the next thing we see is Ray Liotta's character, Captain T.C. Doyle, arriving at a very fictional army base where we find ourselves just surrounded by helicopters. Dallas, what can you tell us about the helicopters in this scene?
Sure. So the first helicopter that you see is called a Bell AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter. These helicopters were designed for close air support. They were outfitted with rocket pods, and their sole focus was rooting out entrenched forces through the use of overwhelming firepower. The next helicopters that we see, the one that, as you mentioned, Ray Liotta's character boards, is the iconic UH-1 Huey. This was a versatile trendsetter of a helicopter. It set the stage for aggressive aerial deployment throughout the war. It was used in all sorts of duties out in the field: troop transport, medevac, supply missions, command and control. The list goes on. And in some cases, they were even outfitted to act as sort of a lighter attack helicopter, outfitted with rocket pods, extra machine guns, that sort of thing.
And apparently in this movie, it's used to transport a single person, one person, to a remote mountain village. It's great use of Army logistics in a helicopter. But we're looking beyond that. Again, some things are just for story. But after Captain Doyle arrives, he finds a helicopter and a crew to take him to the village. Side note, he's not that nice to them, which means they're not that nice to him when they actually transport him. So that's a little bit of the fun. And when they arrive, he's greeted by a group of local mountain men in camouflage. Now, we do apologize for our pronunciation, but we did want to talk a little bit about the Army, local support during the Vietnam, and about these local mountain villagers known as the Montagnard. Dallas, what can you tell us about them?
Sure. So the Montagnard is a term used to describe a collection of indigenous villages within the central highlands of Vietnam. It was given a French name due to the colonization efforts they undertook with Vietnam. The French had previously fought a war with Vietnam, so you could see where that comes from. The army, as well as the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, that's the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, they also wanted to court the Montagnard as a strong ally due to their status within Vietnam, because they were an ethnic minority. If South Vietnam was to fall, religious and cultural practices of the Montagnards would be under threat by the centralized communist regime to the north. They were primed for recruitment, and their knowledge of natural geography, culture, and fighting ability made them excellent candidates for allies.
Thank you. And you can definitely see how these actors who were hired to play the Montagnard definitely smoke Captain Doyle going up this hill. And their knowledge that they try to instill on him about the area, what to eat, what not to eat, what trails to take, when to take these trails. But the funniest part is just them sprinting up this hill while Captain Doyle is struggling to just walk up it. But once Captain Doyle arrives at the village, we meet Danny Glover's character, Captain Sam Cahill, who introduces Doyle to the village elders and the village elephant Poe. This is not played by Ty. This is a separate elephant. But later that evening, they go see the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Dallas, many of us are familiar of the name, what it was, but can you explain a little bit more about the Ho Chi Minh Trail?
Absolutely. So we all know that logistics is important for any military in the world. You need to feed your troops, you need to supply them, you need vehicles, arms, all of that. In order for soldiers, for the North Vietnamese to supply the Viet Cong and other insurgencies in the area, they utilized what was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was an effective route of roads and paths that stretched all along the western border of Vietnam, even into countries like Laos and Cambodia. It was estimated in a CIA analysis between 1966 and 1971 that North Vietnam shipped over 50,000 tons of ammunition, 400,000 weapons, 100,000 tons of food, and over 640,000 personnel moved along the trail. What made this trail so difficult for the US military to target was that it was strategically placed along the border with other sovereign nations that the United States did not wish to pull into the war. Remember, the US was trying to combat global communism. Not a good look if you start bombing other countries around the area. And you didn't want to provoke sympathies to communism through that military action. Another reason was that the environment of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a thick jungle canopy, mountainous terrain. This was rugged area. And worse yet, the weather created fog and a really difficult time to carpet bomb, airstrike, go in and, attack the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Lastly, the Vietnamese were very effective at making quick repairs along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These were hardy people. These were people who, some of them were veterans even from fighting the French. So a lot of these guys, they are used to just making quick repairs out in very, very dangerous environments.
So this sounds a little different from what Cahill and Doyle kind of described. Cahill and Doyle, when they're out at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they kind of describe it as this thing that appears and reappears and disappears at different areas in Vietnam. That doesn't sound like that was the case.
Yeah, and you have to put yourself into the shoes of a soldier, right? And you think about, every time you strike at this Ho Chi Minh Trail, this elusive Ho Chi Minh Trail, it just seems to just get fixed the next day, right? The supplies keep flowing in.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this was something the Defense Department just constantly struggled with. You will see later on in the war that we strike into Cambodia largely to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But it remains a constant thorn in the side. So you can see where Cahill and Doyle are just like, we don't understand this. It keeps moving.
This is it.
Right.
You literally see Cahill. He says it is like, were you surprised? I was. I'm like, so this is why, because they're expecting this massive road. It's just like a little tiny trail just through the woods, through the mountains, similar to what you would take on the Appalachian Trail or, another small wooded trail through a national park. It's just a little tiny trail. So let's go back to Cahill and Doyle. They see the trail, they're remarking at it, and then they hear guns firing and race back to the village where they learn that the North Vietnamese have killed the village elephant. And to keep the village on the American side, Cahill promises that Doyle, who they're blaming for this bad experience, unlucky experience, will get a new elephant before an upcoming festival. Next, the movie cuts to an army base with Cahill and Doyle arguing about the importance of this village and the elephant to another character, Major Peterson, who tells them to get the elephant. But before they leave, we're introduced to the rest of the soldiers that join them. We have Specialist 4 Harvey Ashford, played by Dougie Doug, normally goes by H.A. Specialist 5 Lawrence Farley, played by Corin Nemec, and Lieutenant David Poole, played by Dennis Leary. Each of the characters seem to portray some type of stereotype, even Doyle and Cahill. Overly superstitious, scared one, clumsy one, and of course, Dennis Leary plays the really slimy guy you love to hate, but in the end, he's got a heart of gold, so you end up loving his character because of what he does at the end. But now we're going to a river where there's just tons of elephants, and we meet a very well-known actor, James Hong, who plays Ibrahim, and he's responsible for the entire operation that's at this river. He even tries to get the men to pay for him to come and be the person who helps guide the elephant in the group back to this village. And then they discover he's blind and he might not be the best fit. So for the money the army has, he brings out Bo Tot and Lin, played by Tai and Din Lee. And they walk out of the village on their way to the air transport. So Dallas, perhaps here we should take a break. And when we come back, we can talk about the real mission that's inspired the movie. Okay, we're back. And before we summarize the rest of the movie, let's talk about the actual real event that inspired the movie. It started with Captain John Scott Gant, who devised a scheme to fly a pair of elephants to a remote mountain village in 1968. It started a few years prior when the Army started to train the Montagnards to operate a lumber operation, which would save the Army from importing lumber from the United States, which already sounds mystifying that you would have to import lumber from a country across the ocean. However, the rough terrain that's in Vietnam, which we've already discussed with the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the mountains, the Central Highlands, trucks and tracked vehicles are getting destroyed. They just won't work. So the village elders actually suggest using elephants, which is what they did centuries, generations before. So the army tries to figure out how to get two Indian elephants from Bandon to Tra Bong, which is about 300 miles apart. And this is where some of the movie gets its funnier scenes that you think are just made for Hollywood, but have a little bit of taste of reality in them. So first they were going to walk them to a river, load them onto barges. Elephants apparently get seasick, so that doesn't really work. So then they want to fly them. But the army realizes that the Air Force won't talk to them unless these elephants are tranquilized. So they're sedated and loaded onto C-130 airplanes and flown to Da Nang, which was the closest airfield to the village. So this actually happened. Then they were wrapped in cargo nets. And you can actually find video of this. If we can find a link and even embedded into the video, we can. They're like sandwiched into these cargo nets and cushions, and they look kind of cozy, even though it looks really uncomfortable for them, but it's while they're sedated. And they are flown by Sikorsky HH-3E helicopters, also known as the Jolly Green Giant, to fly the final 65 miles over the mountains to a clearing near the village where they're greeted with multiple press outlets. And even seeing the pictures, it's like, wow, this happened. This is real. This is not made up for Hollywood. So Dallas, has the Army done anything like this before, either in Vietnam or other conflicts?
So, parachuting animals in the Army has always been a strange and fascinating topic. I think when most people look back on the history of animals parachuting with our armed forces, they're drawn to the imagery of paradogs in the modern US Army. Those are usually associated with paratroopers. There's sparse information during World War II regarding a few instances where dogs were utilized. There's the story of Smokey, the Yorkshire Terrier, the 5th Air Force. He was parachuted from trees, but due to the small stature of Yorkie, they avoided a major drop. This was more of a publicity stunt. In regards to domesticated animals, though, the Army had a brief stint where it attempted to parachute mules for logistical reasons. Part of what you described earlier about the terrain and the environment. This was a bit of a difficult experiment. The technology of World War II made it very difficult for many of these animals, and there were a number of deaths that followed in the attempts to parachute them to operational zones. The British, however, were more successful on that front. There was also Rocky, an Asian black bear during the Korean War, with the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team. She earned a Purple Heart after 2 paradrops, and she was injured in an artillery strike, so that's where the Purple Heart comes from. Lastly, logistical drops in Vietnam existed throughout the war. This gets more to the topic at hand. More often than not, these drops were full of animals like chickens, pigs, and occasionally cows. Due to the small nature of chickens and pigs, they'd be placed in baskets and parachuted in. A bit less dramatic than the elephant in the movie, but you can kind of see where the Army had a vested interest in supplying these villages. Because keep in mind, too, more than a publicity stunt, it's just good for the villagers and the South Vietnamese people to see the United States providing these supplies.
Wow. I would love to be the soldier on the ground that sees a bear being parachuted down towards me. That sounds like a Hollywood film. What, they just came out with Cocaine Bear? I think they need to put Cocaine Bear in the air now because that happened. But let's get back to, okay, we need to get back to Vietnam. Wow, you've already mentioned how this was very helpful and why they did it, and why this was important to collaboration. But can you dive a little more into it so that we can get Kathleen's mind off of parachuting wild animals from planes?
Sure. So local support for our mission in Vietnam was always part of the objective, but it continued to be a problem throughout the war. South Vietnam itself was a complex web of internal politics and regional divisions that made it difficult for the Army to collaborate with the forces in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government had a very difficult relationship with the Montagnards that made collaboration borderline impossible at times. A storied history of persecution, colonialism, and forced relocation certainly didn't help. Still, the Army valued the Montagnards' abilities, and while they were recruited by advisors relatively early on in the war, their involvement increased tenfold as the Ho Chi Minh Trail proved to be a thorn in the side of South Vietnam and the U.S. military.
Thanks, Dallas. This will be good to keep in mind as we go through the movie. And now let's go back to the movie and our Fellowship of the Elephant, heading towards a dangerous mountain. So after picking up Bo Tat and Lin, the group arrives at the airstrip where the Air Force pilots refuse to let Bo Tat aboard unless she's either dead or tranquilized. Small callback to the historic mission where the Air Force wouldn't let the elephants on the plane. Lieutenant Poole then produces water buffalo tranquilizers, which are humorously given to Bo Tat, and they board the plane. Now, at this point, we're only 40 minutes into the movie, so obviously something has to happen to make this journey more difficult, because they're not actually landing where they're supposed to land. Bo Tat wakes up mid-flight, plane lands, everyone is kicked off, Bo Tat and everyone runs off the plane trying to catch her. Dallas, this is probably where you could tell us how the Army and Air Force worked together during Vietnam.
Sure. So by now, the split between the Air Force and the Army had long been in effect. As you can see throughout the movie, there were times where objectives and collaboration became difficult to work around. The Army had focused on overarching security efforts in South Vietnam, while the Air Force was focused on bombing missions against strategic targets in North Vietnam and close air support for our ground troops throughout the country. So you can sort of see with that scene, it shows a little glimpse of that division.
Thanks, Dallas. So also, just so everyone knows, this isn't like a normal movie, TV show podcast where we're like diving in and it's like at minute 32, at this, you can see an Easter egg here. We would be here for hours because there's so many little things, not only related to the movie that makes it fun, but also the Army history that we really want to dive into, but we would be here forever. And I don't think anyone wants to spend that much time on a 1995 movie, but maybe they do. So if you do, let us know, because there are some things we're not talking about, like the patches on their hats, which is driving me nuts that we're not talking about. But we can talk about that in other ways. So let us know. So back to the movie. After being kicked off this plane, our group is walking. They eventually get a truck, and then they make their way for a town for food and supplies for Bo Tat. And this is where we start seeing members of the North Vietnamese, or our villains of the movie, following the group. And shortly after the group leaves, the truck breaks down because it has to. There's no way Journey can make it easy in this kind of movie, especially since we're barely halfway through it. We've broken down near a river where they're almost immediately picked up by a Frenchman piloting his boat down the river, who was well known to inform on both sides of the war. Dallas, can you think of anyone like this character or a situation where someone is feeding information to both sides?
Sure. So first, I'd kind of point to the interesting choice of making a Frenchman the informant. We talked about France's colonial history with Vietnam. I would believe that most French would be quite upset with the North Vietnamese government after their defeat in 1954. But that was when the French had attempted to hold on to the remnants of their colonial empire, and they were defeated, like I said, North Vietnamese. That being said, informants have always been a part of the Army's prerogative throughout conflicts, stretching as far back as the inception of this country. There's a fascinating story I can think of. You asked, can you think of any other character? Regarding a certain double agent informant in the Revolutionary War, that being James Armistead Lafayette, a man who informed both for the colonial army and the British. Of course, the security of informants remains a constant worry for the Army even to this day. I recently participated in a program here at the National Museum of the United States Army with INSCOM, the United States Army Intelligence and Security Command, and I believe the presenters there put it best. Operational security cannot be entrusted to informants, no matter how virtuous they seem.
Thanks, Dallas. Yes, and if anyone is interested in learning more about Lafayette, James Armistead Lafayette, and the inner workings of spies and informants, the Spy Museum in DC is a great place to start, but also our National Army Museum has some great programs too. But I really hope, with how friendly this French guy is, that people were smart enough to know probably shouldn't share everything with him. Because in the movie, he actually shows a frame that's double-sided. One side has one leadership, other side has the other leadership. So hopefully someone noticed that on his boat, which also has a nice open window where you can see the backside of the frame, or at least didn't trust him with everything. So now we're back on the boat with our merry band of friends. And the North Vietnamese has, of course, caught them in a very tiny boat. And this is where SP4 Ashford reveals that he's in artillery. This very scared, superstitious person is in artillery and calls in an airstrike to take care of the enemy boat. Dallas, I feel like an airstrike that's portrayed in the movie might take a little more time to coordinate than a few minutes. It seems to happen like that. And I feel like there might be more worthy targets, but what do you think?
Well, there's definitely a bit of Hollywood magic happening right there. But to be honest, the idea isn't too far-fetched. U.S. forces were very generous with the application of fire support in the field. Range and accessibility was always a constant concern for troops, but the ease of overwhelming firepower and access to that firepower when it was available, soldiers eagerly could rely upon it. So I think it's just trying to portray the message of, look, whenever they need it, they can call upon it, sort of deal.
And I think right now this is a good place to take a break. And when we get back, we'll find out what happens to Bo Tat and our Fellowship of the Elephant. So now our group is on land again. They've left the boat and they start walking and making their way to Pleiku Air Base. Once they've arrived, they're told by Major Peterson that the mission is canceled because the Ho Chi Minh Trail moved, in quotation marks, and the village is of no strategic importance, and the old CIA airstrip where they were going to use was blown up, so there's no place to land this elephant. And this is where we see the plan for parachuting an elephant out of a plane comes in. After leaving the major's office, the group starts making a plan to steal a plane, steal pilots, steal equipment, all under the Army's radar, all against orders, to drop Bo Tat and themselves into a mountain village using parachutes. How are they able to do this, you might ask? Well, Lieutenant Poole, our slimy quartermaster guy, he uses a secret paper, in quotation marks, secret, which serves as orders to get pilots and to get by security. They just show this piece of paper and be like, you can't talk about this. This is secret. You have to do this. And these pilots go. So Dallas, how far do you think they would have gotten if this was really the Army?
So once again, there's a bit more of that movie magic happening. There is no paper that provides you, passage like that. This would certainly land any true soldier in a world of trouble. There's a chain of command, of course, and throughout history, that's sometimes been stretched to a straining point for the sake of operational success. But to this level, it certainly lands Lieutenant Poole and his friends in front of a court-martial. Of course, you can't just make up orders. That's a huge violation of security.
I will say, though, in the movie, it builds up the drama. You feel it, like, oh, they're doing it in secret. Ooh, they're going to get in trouble. Ooh, but they're doing something good. So it definitely goes along with the whole build up and crescendo in a movie, which makes it fun and entertaining. And of course, no one's caught. The plane takes off. It encounters enemy fire as they approach the village and gets to the point where everyone needs to bail out, including the pilots. Receive fire. The engines are on fire. Everyone just needs to bail out. Everyone. However, as Bo Tat's crate is beginning its descent through the plane, the cord that would have pulled her chute snaps. And the one person you didn't think cared, Captain Doyle immediately free falls, just dives after her to catch up to her and releases the chute. And Bo Tat and everyone lands safely, except for, of course, our scaredy cat, SP4 Ashford, who lands in a tree. And obviously, they did not use Ty for the parachute stunt. Disney, in this case, used an animatronic elephant that would move and sway to make it look like there was an elephant in the crate. And they didn't make Ray Liotta catch up to the crate. They had a stunt diver or paratrooper do that for him. I also have questions about whether or not that would be possible to just hold on his arm. I feel like he'd break his arm if he did what he actually did based on the force and, science, STEM, technology, math, all that kind of stuff. Dallas, what can you tell us about paratroopers in Vietnam? Because I know when I think of paratroopers, Vietnam does not come to my mind. I think of World War II, some of the more modern missions, not necessarily Vietnam.
And I don't think you're alone in that belief. I think World War II gets such a prominent focus because it was the first truly large-scale paratrooper war. While the war in Vietnam was focused on rooting out an insurgency and capturing material to deny the opposing force tactical advantage. There were a few airborne operations in Vietnam, the largest occurring when an infantry battalion and an artillery battalion of the 173rd Airborne Brigade were airdropped during Operation Junction City. Furthermore, the focus on air mobility, harken back to those UH-1 Hueys, especially with the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, was quite prominent, leading to a shift in overall airborne doctrine. Strike hard, strike fast, use the Hueys, use helicopters, overwhelming firepower, that sort of doctrine.
All right, we're almost finished with the movie. So now everyone has landed, but the village is overtaken by the same Vietnamese army who has been following them the entire time. And SP4 Ashford, who was stuck in the tree, immediately gets out, comes charging into the village, firing into the air, which somehow makes the Vietnamese drop their weapons and give up. But it ends. The next scene is Bo Tot participating in the festival with her young companion Lynn playing with local children for the first time. And the credits roll with the heartwarming song When I See an Elephant Fly from Disney's Dumbo playing in the background. Dallas, what'd you think of this movie?
I thought it was entertaining. I think it's easy for a historian to go through and poke and prod at Hollywood movies for having different inaccuracies and such. But with Operation Dumbo Drop, honestly, I found myself more often than not being like, this is a Disney movie about the Vietnam War? I mean, it's a children's movie that covers one of the most difficult and controversial wars in American history. The Vietnam War usually requires a pretty delicate touch, yet Disney opted for comedy. It's quite interesting when you put it in the context of reflecting upon the war. I touched on this earlier a bit, but after the Vietnam War, the way that the media portrayed and discussed the war evolved throughout the decades. What do I mean by that? The 1970s and 1980s sort of reflected the hopelessness and the trauma of veterans who served, while the 1990s aimed to reconcile the message of the war by showing the heart of veterans. I believe from the 2000s and onward, the message swapped to reflecting more of a message of remembrance. This was likely inspired by a bit of a revitalization of patriotism following 9/11 and the post 9/11 era. Either way, it remains a fascinating bit of media, especially for Disney, which I keep coming back to. I mean, who would have thought that Disney would have made a movie about the Vietnam War?
Definitely. Same. Would not think Vietnam at all. But Disney did devote a huge portion of their time during World War II making training films, propaganda, public service films for home and abroad. You'll also see some popular Disney characters like Donald and Mickey in camo and army gear. And Disney has, of course, released content related to other wars. War Horse was one of their films that they did in conjunction. Cadet Kelly, that's a little more of a deep cut in terms of early 2000s. And some older films like The Great Locomotive Chase and Miracle of the White Stallions, which you recently researched, right? Operation Cowboy about the Lipizzaner Stallions.
Oh, that's right. Like you mentioned, I recently watched Miracle of the White Stallions for my Operation Cowboy article that was just published last week. It's interesting to see how Disney took historical events, added a bit of Hollywood flair into the mix. You kind of touched on those World War II training, propaganda, public service films. That might be something that we look forward to in the future, maybe covering on this podcast.
And of course, we're welcome to ideas as we dive into regrowing our podcast and providing more content as people are always looking for in different mediums. But I want to thank you for joining us for this movie review of 1995's Operation Dumbo Drop. Please follow our podcast for updates on this season's episodes. And if you're looking for more Army history, please visit our website at www.armyhistory.org. Thank you.